Hey guys, Ken Smith Fishing. So, Merry Christmas. I'm shooting this on the afternoon, on Christmas afternoon. And I got to tell you guys that are coming out here to fish this spring what a buddy of mine called me. So, a buddy of mine lives right by Castle Boykins Ramp, and he called me on, what's today? Today's Sunday. So he called me yesterday, sent me a text yesterday morning, and he said, one boat at the ramp, and it was cold and windy. He said, one boat at Monterey Ramp yesterday morning. Clayton Bullware's truck was there. So Clayton planning on being real competitive this year, apparently. So every year at the end of the year, I go through all of my rods and all of my reels and stuff. So man, I step on rods. I'm real bad about poking the ceramic out of the end of them, poking baits loose. And I try to stay up to date on the loose stuff, actually on everybody's stuff, and kind of buy the newest stuff, or at least try to stay up to date and have kind of current equipment, best equipment available. So I'm gonna do two, this one will be a little longer than the next one, 2 videos. The first one I'm gonna talk about rods. And by the way, I'm not only carrying Lew's rods, and that's part of my deal with Lew's is I carry whatever fits that specific type of fishing. That's like I carry Titleist irons, but I don't carry a Titleist putter. So I carry a little bit of whatever works for that particular style of fishing. I've had some guys share some stuff with me that I really like, so I'm gonna share some of those rods, just guys, because I've got one thing I've been struggling for years with one particular type of fishing. So in my mind, there's kind of 4 big categories of rods you need. There's drag fishing, right, where you're dragging a bait. There's moving baits, there's topwater, and then there's flipping. That's in general. Now, underneath those main categories, drag fishing's pretty simple, right? It's football jigs, it's Carolina rigs, it's dragging a worm, it's something like it's reeling a Biffle bug or a swing head, whatever you want to call it. Moving baits, however, I think there's single hooks and there's trebles, and they're very different types of hooks or rods you want to use, and then it gets broken out even further below that, and I'll talk about that. Topwaters, I think there's one hook topwaters. Think of a frog versus treble hooks, and then you got to think about if you're throwing something like a whopper plopper versus something like a simple little hopping bait or a walking bait, a catwalk. So there's a lot of different rods that are going in that category, and then flipping. And in the flipping world, I think there's 2 basic kind of rods. There's a traditional, sorry about that, I had a frog in my throat. There's the traditional bend of a rod, and then there's a parabolic bend. And I'll talk about which I use for both of those. So and by the way, I've got my rods scattered across the deck. So what I did was I lay my rods out, and I'm like, all right, I buy rods I don't use, but I buy rods that I buy over and over and over. And when I do that, it's because I like them and I'm using them for different things. So I'm gonna kind of walk you through what I'm using here. So for drag baits, I really use kind of 2 rods. I use, that's not it. There we go. I use this rod right here. This is a mag heavy cover. It's a 7 foot 6-inch heavy action rod. That's what I use for swing heads. It's obviously what I use for Carolina rigs. It's what I'll throw big worms on when I'm dragging big worms. I use a little different rod for brush pile fishing, but that rod will work there as well. I have, I think, 3 of those rods that are in fishing condition that I haven't trashed up somehow by stepping on them or closing the car door on them or something. So that rod, again, and by the way, I'm gonna put links to every one of these rods down below, basically showing you what that rod is and my coloring of a rod. So for example, that rod now looks a little bit different because this is very silver on that rod. So although the rods may not look exactly the same of the links I show you, it's the same rod. They've just updated it. I'm using a year or 2 or 3, or in some cases 4-year-old rods in the boat. The other rod I use when I need to throw something further, and this is probably more often my Biffle bug rod, but it's also my football jig rod, is a Super Duty 3. And I'll tell you, matter of fact, let me just say it now. This is also my A-rig rod. I use the same rod for an A-rig. It's a big, giant 7 foot 11-inch rod. It's got a lot of handle, if you will, from the reel seat to the butt. So it's real comfortable to move that bait way out there. It takes up a lot of slack when you set the hook because it's such a long rod. And those are my 2 drag rods. And I can use either one of those for the other situation if I need to, meaning that I could throw the Super Duty rod as my Biffle bug rod, or the Magnum heavy cover as my Biffle bug rod. But there's a little more tip in that Super Duty 3 than that mag head cover, heavy cover, I think. So I think I can throw stuff a little bit further with that Super Duty 3. Okay, moving baits. Single hook to me would be a spinnerbait, be a swim jig, stuff like that. And for pretty much all of those, I use, and by the way, this is probably the rod, oops, that knocked that rod. This is probably the rod that I have used for the most applications. You can see it's got a frog on it right now. It's a very short handle rod from there to there. I love it for up close pitching under stuff. This is a Magnum jig rod. This is one of my favorite rods. It's a 7'3". It's a medium heavy, but I'll tell you, it reads as a medium heavy. It feels a lot heavier than a medium heavy rod to me. This is also a rod I'll talk about in a minute I use for some topwater applications. That's an excellent rod. And what I like is having these rods that I can use for multiple applications. So, I mean, I'm not Brian Thrift, right? I don't have a closet full of reels that I don't use. Or, I mean, if y'all saw his man cave, looked like he had 200 rods standing there that he's never used. I'm not like that. I got a lot of rods, but I use everything I own. There's not a rod, and there may be a rod in here I hadn't caught fish on, but there's not a rod in here I hadn't fished with. So single hooks, moving baits, that's my main go-to rod. What I have struggled with is still chatterbait. I still cannot make up my mind what the right chatterbait rod is. Now, I've been throwing 2 recently. I've been throwing that KVD. It's a composite rod. It is, what's the model? This is the CC4 model. This, by the way, is a great value rod. This rod was on sale, actually still may be on sale for 69 bucks in the Tackle Warehouse year-end sale, so there'll be a link to that rod. This is a rod that one of my viewers said, hey, this is a rod you need to check out. So this is made by Omega Custom Rods. It's a 7'2", medium heavy. It's a, I believe that's, I'm not sure what the blank is on that, but I'll put a link to how you can get one of those. So I'm going back and forth between those 2 rods. Frankly, I never settled on a rod last year, and there hadn't been a good enough chatterbait bite to settle on a rod this year. I lose and have lost historically more fish on a chatterbait than any other bait. I lose more fish on a chatterbait than I lose on a rattle trap. So I continue to try to figure out what the perfect rod is for that. If you guys got thoughts on that and you've really settled on a rod you love, please share. I'd love to hear about it. So those are my single hook moving bait rods. Now, treble hook, I got to break that into more categories. So the first category I'm going to break treble hooks into, moving baits with treble hooks, is going to be in a rattle bait. Quake, the new Duke, a rattle trap, I mean, you name it, whatever rattle bait you like to throw. And I have really settled on one rod. It is the Mag Bass 3. There it is. Mag Bass Rod 3. So the Mag Bass Rod 3, this rod is this is a 7'6" medium heavy rod. This is a rod I'm ordering more of. It's a rod that I don't have enough of. I've got 3 of them right now, and the other one up here you'll see. Actually, I'll talk about it right now. This is also the rod I use to throw big worms into brush piles with. I like the bend on it. It's not a parabolic, but it's not too stiff, because to me, I want to be able to kind of ease those fish out, but I also want, if I need to lean on them, I can lean on them. That's a great rod, and it's a manageable rod based upon the length of the rod, right? So that's my rod for rattle baits. Now, square bill's real simple for me. So for me, square bill is up close, usually fishing rocks, fishing something shallow. And by the way, this is a great priced rod. This is a less than $100 rod anyway. It's called the Perfect Crankbait Rod. It's a little 7'3" rod. It's called a medium heavy. It is not a medium heavy. It's a medium action rod is what it really boils down to. But that's the rod. I've got like 5 of these. That's a great rod. The only downside to this rod is, like, I've tried to use this rod as my topwater rod, and it just, for me, I struggle throwing really, really light baits. Now you can see I'm throwing a 1.0 right there, but I struggle throwing really light baits with this rod because it's not quite long enough. I wish they made this action rod, and they probably do. I don't have it. This action rod and a little bit longer rod would be ideal. But that is pretty much, that's not true. That's the rod I use a lot for square billing. Now, if the fish get on a really good square bill grass bite, I will go right back to the same rod I'm throwing that rattle trap on, that rattle bait on. I'll go right back to that mag bass rod 3 because I want to be able to lean on and pull them out of there, especially if I have a bigger hook. I can use a bigger bait, a bigger, heavier rod. When it's rocks and other stuff, wood, that's my rod. When it's grass, I go back to that mag bass rod 3. Okay, so the last thing for treble hooks is big, deep cranking rod. And actually, I kind of break them down by different categories. This is the only 6-inch rod I have in my boat. I've tried several of them, but this is a Lux rod. It's a 7-foot 5-inch, heavy, fast. I have no idea even what that rod costs, but I'll give you a link down below. That's really become, and you can see I've actually got a square bill on there, but this has really become my Cloud 6, Cloud 9 rod. It's the rod I like for a little bit shallower cranking. But when I go up, so I still carry a bunch of the old Mark Rose rods, but they don't make them anymore. You can still find them. I think actually Tackle Warehouse still has a few of them. And I've even got the 9-foot version over there that I use when I'm really trying to cover a ton of water and really throw a great big crankbait way out there. But this is that full handle rod that Lew's makes. This rod is called a ledge raider rod. It's a 7-foot, 10.5 inches, and it's called a medium, it's called a heavy action rod. You can see that's an 8XD on it. You can sling any size crankbait on that. You can throw a 10XD. Now I do usually go to a little bigger rod when I'm throwing a 10XD. A lot of times I'll throw it on a Super Duty 3 rod, but that's really become the rod. I've got a couple of those. That's my big crankbait rod. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about topwaters. So one hook, again, mostly frog fishing, that same rod. You can see I have literally worn the grip out on that particular rod. It's the mag jig rod, 7-foot 3 rod. It's got tons of juice to pull fish out of anywhere, and I like that little short handle. It's just so much easier to manage it when you're working a bait down low. So that is, I've got more of that rod than any other rod. As a matter of fact, there's not a single thing I have described fishing wise that I can't do with that rod if I could only have one rod. That little 7.3 rod, which is funny, I've always been a big long rod guy, but that would be my key rod if I could only carry one rod with me. If I was going to a pond, or if you said, hey, come fishing with me, do you only bring one rod? That's the rod I would bring. Now, topwater treble hooks, again, on heavy stuff. So like if I'm throwing a catwalk or a, sorry guys, the phone rang. So if I'm throwing any kind of big walking bait, a catwalk, a dogma, anything like that, I go back up and I throw that same rod, that mag jig rod. It's just, again, I like that short handle. It's so easy to work, and that rod is plenty stout to throw that. Now, I do have one rod that I've actually got several of that's sort of a specialty rod. Let me rephrase that I use as sort of a specialty rod, and that's that Super Duty 2 rod. So it's the same length as a Super Duty 3, but it's a medium heavy rod. You can see it's what I throw my wake bait on. This is also the rod I throw my whopper plopper on if I'm just slinging it, right? What I mean by that is, if I'm at Lake of the Ozarks and I got to throw it places where I really got to control where it lands, this rod's too long to do that. But when I'm out on a grass flat and I'm just slinging a whopper plopper, I can control it enough with that big long rod, and I can throw it a long ways that I like it, and it's heavy enough that if I load up on something, now it's sort of a parabolic bend, so when you load up on them, you can't jerk them out, but once they're stuck, they're stuck. When I'm throwing those same bait, when I'm throwing a plopper, because that's kind of a specialty, and I'm throwing it up close, guess what? I go right back to that mag jig rod again, because it's short enough I can control it, and it's plenty stiff enough that I can throw it and I can pull fish out with it. So when I'm throwing smaller baits, and I'm thinking here specifically of like a pop or lighter baits, let me put it that way, lighter baits, I go to that Mag Bass series, but I drop all the way back and I throw a Mag Bass Rod 1. It's also a 7-foot 6-inch rod, but it's a perfect action to throw that. That's also become the rod. I don't do a whole lot of jerkbait fishing, but that's also become my jerkbait rod. That's another rod that if somebody, and I'd love to know about it in the Lose Rod series, they really love their jerkbait rod or even a 6-cents rod. I'd like to hear what you guys are throwing those on, because I'd like to have another jerkbait rod. And you know, interestingly, I'm gonna mention this rod as well. This is a Kincaid rod, and the guy who makes these reached out to me and said, hey, I want to build you a rod. What are you interested in? And I told him I was still searching for a jerkbait or a chatterbait rod. He built me this rod. I've not got to fish it with chatterbaits, but what's interesting, this particular rod's a 7'3" rod, and I find myself picking this rod up more and more and more. So I like that. It's a really versatile little rod. I haven't really settled on it as a specialty rod for anything in particular, but it's just a rod I continue to pick up quite a bit. And that's a rod also I've fooled with a little bit throwing a jerkbait that might or might not be a great jerkbait rod. Once I decide on that, I'll let you know. Okay, flipping. For flipping, again, I think there's normal and parabolic. So normal for me is grass flipping, flipping shallow wood, flipping boat docks, any of that stuff. And the rod I use is this rod right here, and I've got a bunch of them. It's the Magnum flipping stick. It's a 7'6" heavy action rod. You can see there, I've only got a 3/8 weight on it. You can even still flip that, but you'll see down here, it's also the rod. You guys have been seeing me flip some grass through the summer. That's a 1-ounce sinker, but you can flip that with that rod. I love that rod, and it's a great traditional bend rod to pull fish out. Now, haven't done it in some time, but I learned something watching, my gosh, the guy's name has just escaped me, and I can't believe that. He just made the elites. He's out of Oklahoma. He does some great videos. You guys know who I'm talking about. His name will come to me in a minute. But he won an event in Florida. I want to say Okeechobee, but it might have been Harris Shane's. And he was flipping reed heads. And he went to a parabolic bend rod because these fish were way down in there, and a lot of times they had moved by the time he stuck them. And he couldn't drag them out. These were 5 and 6 and 7 pound fish, but he could keep them stuck, and that rod stayed loaded. So even when they came out of one thing and went to something else, from one reed head to another, they stayed loaded. So I have gone exclusively, you know, a couple of years ago here, we had 10, 15, and in some cases 20-foot deep bushes we were fishing. And you're just not gonna straight pull a 6-pounder out of a 20-foot, 15-foot bush. So I've gone to a parabolic rod when I do that, and it's the Super Duty 3. And I'll tell you, that's a great big, really heavy rod, and it will wear you down fishing with it all day. But it is the rod that, look, if I got a 5-pounder stuck in there, I don't care how tired it makes my arms, I want to pull him out. That's the rod that I've really gone to as my parabolic bend rod. It's not a actual parabolic bend rod, but it really does bend through most of the rod. Well, I say that. In my mind, a parabolic bend rod, it bends kind of the same all the way through the blank. And I don't think any actually do. But it's got a lot more of the blank bends than does that Magnum heavy flipping rod I was talking about just a second ago. So those are my main rods. I think there's probably 7 to 9 styles of rods, very much like golf clubs, that you need to have. I do have one other specialty rod that I've really been playing with quite a bit, and it came from those same guys at Omega Rods. This is a great big rod. This is a 7'10". It's a composite rod. It's a surprisingly lightweight rod. I am almost certain it says North Fork, so I guess it's a North Fork blank. You can see it. I've been throwing a mag draft on it. I've been throwing a lot of stuff on this. I've been throwing a big crankbait on this rod some as well. So that's a neat specialty rod that I've been playing with. But most of my stuff is Lose, a little bit of 6 cents, a little bit of Omega, and a little bit of Kincaid. I think I've got 1 or 2 Kincaid rods. So got a little bit of everything, and you know what? if I find a putter or a driver that works better than what I'm using with Lew's, I'll switch to it. I'm in this game to catch fish for tournaments and just for fun. When I stick one, I want to catch him. So I've actually asked the guys at 6 Cents. There's a couple of things I'm still looking for in a rod I want to improve upon, well, specifically that chatterbait. I still haven't settled on that. And I don't do a lot of spinning rod fishing. So I've talked to 6 Cents about a spinning rod, and they're going to hook me up, see if we can find a spinning rod that I'm comfortable with. And if I do, I'll share that with you guys as well. And they actually said, we got some stuff we want you to try and some of the other stuff you're using in Lew's and kind of compare and contrast. So I'll share that with y'all when we get that stuff. So I hope that's helpful. Again, links to everything down below. All those links are back to Tackle Warehouse if Tackle Warehouse carries these rods, or to the actual manufacturer if they don't. If you go to one of these manufacturers that's not through Tackle Warehouse, please let them know where you heard about them. I'm not looking for anything from those guys, but I love letting them know that talking with me and helps them out. And of course, obviously, if you shop with the Tackle Warehouse link, that benefits Ken Smith Fishing, and that's much appreciated. So come back later this week or early next week. I'll talk a little bit about reels. It'll be a much shorter conversation, but I think that will be hopefully of interest to you guys as well. So thanks for tuning in, guys. We'll see y'all soon.